Hello, my name is Heather Douglas. I am an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University, and I will be your host for today's panel on volunteer public engagement as part of public engagement with science, defining and measuring success. First, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the format of the event for today. So we have 4 panelists. Each panelist will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. Panelists will then have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the issues raised in their talks among each other, because I'm sure they have a lot to discuss with each other. And then we'll open the floor to questions and answers from the audience as a whole. Please use the question and answer function in Zoom to ask questions. And you can also comment on questions and upvote questions for the panelists if there's something in particular you really want them to answer. Please do follow community standards for the event found here at the conference website, and also you found a link to it from your Eventbrite registration confirmation. Recordings of the talks will be posted on the YouTube channel PEWS 2020 after the event. Any technical issues that we can help with, we can't help with everything, but sometimes we can help, please email pews2020.tech@gmail.com. And if you're going to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag PEWS2020. Okay, so that is the mechanics of the event. Be sure as well to join us immediately after the webinar for an open reception through a really interesting platform called Spatial Chat, which allows you to actually self-organize into conversation groups in different rooms. I will post a link to that after the at the end of the webinar in the chat function, so you can all join there. This panel will focus on public engagement efforts that use an open call for public participants. Such efforts include many citizen science efforts, science festivals, and science museum events. To talk about their work with such public engagement efforts, we have 4 outstanding panelists. First, we have Tina Phillips, who is the Assistant Director of the Center for Engagement in Science and Nature at Cornell Lab of Ornithology. She is a board member of the Citizen Science Association and the Society for Conservation Biology's Participatory and Citizen Science Working Group. She served as an author on the recent National Academy of Science study, Learning Through Citizen Science, Enhancing Opportunities by Design. Then we have Darlene Cavalier, who is a professor of practice at Arizona State University's School for Future of Innovation in Society, and is a founder of SciStarter, a founder of Science Cheerleaders, and a co-founder of ECAST. She is also a founding board member of the Citizen Science Association and the co-author of the recently published Field Guide to Citizen Science. Then we have Rebecca Jordan, who is chair of the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on understanding how individuals reason with scientific data. She held postdoctoral fellowships at Princeton University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and was previously a faculty member at Rutgers University. And finally, we have Maja Horst, who is professor of responsible technology at the Technical University of Denmark and professor of science communication at the University of Copenhagen. Among her many publications, she co-authored the 2016 book, Science Communication, Culture, Identity, and Citizenship. She is also a recipient of the Danish Science Minister's Communication Prize. So you can read more about each of our panelists, including statements about how they think about their success in their work on our website. But now let's get this panel started with Tina Phillips.
All right, thank you so much, Heather. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully, do you guys all see that? Okay. Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm honored to be with the other panelists that Heather just mentioned. This is going to be an exciting 4 days of virtual conferencing. As Heather mentioned, I am at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where I have been for more than 2 decades now, researching both the scientific and the societal benefits of citizen science. Trying to advance my slides here. Okay. Citizen science projects, as you all know, are as diverse as they are numerous, as exemplified by these photos. Therefore, the idea of what success looks like can be vastly different depending on the context, the goals, and of course, the audience. Over the last few decades, the field of citizen science has amassed a fair bit of knowledge about what constitutes success, some of which you'll hear about in the coming talks. I'm going to give you sort of a broad 30,000-foot overview of what I have seen and what I have learned to be the most important basic principles to help ensure project success. As an overview, I'll just be talking about these sort of 6 major pillars. First, starting with attending to goals and outcomes, understanding your audience, engaging for retention, effective communication strategies, managing and handling data, and then finally evaluation along the way. So designing for success may actually begin by asking whether citizen science is the best approach. Are there other approaches that might be better? This checklist posed by Pocock et al. Is really a good starting point, and I point people to this quite a lot. If you answer yes to a lot of these questions, then perhaps citizen science is the way to go. If you answer no, there's probably other approaches. But let's assume we're saying yes to a lot of these and take a closer look at some of these issues. So with respect to prioritizing goals early on in a project's life cycle, really early, goals must be prioritized. So this isn't to say that one project can't have multiple goals, but it's important to determine what the project's primary focus or purpose will be. Will it focus mostly on research and monitoring to advance to the scientific literature, or community and social justice? It's exceedingly difficult for a project to simultaneously achieve all of these goals. And so to determine where your primary effort should be and to focus on these goals will be really important to drive activities, and also just serves as a roadmap for guiding the management, the implementation, and the evaluation decisions you make along the way. When you have goals prioritized, for each goal then, it's really important to determine what are those SMART outcomes. These are outcomes that are specific, that they're measurable, they're attainable, relevant, and of course, timely. They can happen in timely fashion. You can see from this diagram that the kinds of goals you prioritize can and should heavily influence the kinds of outcomes you desire. And they should be relevant and realistic. Pie in the sky outcomes are not what we're looking for here. Outcomes need to be really realistic. And so, for example, if your main priority is to enhance individual learning and engagement, you might expect to influence public opinion, science learning, maybe even behavior change, but unlikely to really influence things that happen perhaps at a community level like economic impact. So just really aligning the outcomes to the priority goals goes a long way in project design. So moving along the cycle, another metric for success is really understanding your audience. Citizen science suffers from the general public syndrome where we attempt to engage everyone in the public domain. This is sometimes, just doesn't work. While it's admirable, most projects just don't have the type of capacity to engage the entire general public. So just like prioritizing goals is important, prioritizing your audience is equally important. This means understanding not only the training that will be needed and the supports and the constraints and affordances of those audiences, but also what are their interests? What are their motivations? What do they need? And another important aspect of understanding your audience is also understanding this idea of relevance. Is there a group of stakeholders that finds relevance in the project's overarching questions or research? Conversely, is there a scientist that finds relevance in a question initiated by the community? And does the scientist's host institution also find it relevant? So relevance needs to be there for everyone involved. And really, regardless of the particular audience you hope to reach, citizen science projects must attend to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I would say thus far, citizen science projects have not been able to do this very successfully. We have been dominated by audiences that really do lack diversity. Communities of color have largely been absent. So now is the time we need to address these disparities, beginning with a review of the language that we use in our projects, the images we portray, the access we provide, and the benefits that we espouse to communities and individuals. And genuine commitment to addressing DEI issues, it is challenging, but is no longer an option. And there are numerous resources to help in this regard. Here, I highlight just 2 resources specifically designed for working with community partners to improve science for all of society, but there are hundreds and hundreds of other resources out there. So it's something that we need to take on really with complete and total commitment. Successful projects also provide ample and diverse opportunities for engagement with the science process that tap into more than just the opportunity for data collection. So this graphic you see here is from my PhD dissertation that describes the multiple dimensions of engagement that occur during the course of project engagement. So attending to participant outcomes, participant motivations, their feelings and emotions and social connections, in addition to the emphasis on learning and gathering quality data, can really help maintain engagement with projects. Science is, after all, a team sport, and the more engaged the team is, the better the science will be. And I don't have time to go into all of what's in this graphic, but it's essentially, what it's doing is linking different types of engagement strategies that projects can implement to the different levels of interest of participants, going along this continuum of triggered situational interest, like we're just sparking some interest in people, all the way down to really well-developed individual interests where people really identify with a project. But one thing that you see that I've bolded that remains consistent across all these different levels of interest is making sure the engagement remains fun and enjoyable. This idea of fun and enjoyability is directly tied to intrinsic motivation, which has been shown to be far more influential in maintaining behaviors, and in the case of citizen science, in maintaining retention, than extrinsic motivations like rewards or gamification, or even other forms of carrot and stick kinds of strategies. So keeping it fun and enjoyable is critical. So we've all heard how important feedback is to ensure success, but communication infrastructures should support engagement at all levels. This paper that I'm citing here is from Jenny Priest, the current editor-in-chief for Citizen Science Theory and Practice, and Ben Schneiderman. It's from 2009, but I think it's still very relevant in describing the ways in which online social activities can be supported no matter what level of engagement, from simply being a reader of content to being a contributor or a collaborator to then being a leader. The paper actually comes from a human-computer interaction perspective, but I find that there's a lot of analogies with regard to mass social online participation that could be transferred to the citizen science community. And I would encourage anybody who has an online interface with their participants to take a look at this paper and see some of the key strategies they describe. Another basic and super important principle for success revolves around data management. Many projects have failed because they have not treated the data gathered with the respect and care that it deserves. And when you're going into a space of online data management, there's all of these issues that need to be attended to, including the types of data collection you will offer, access and protocols, and data export and visualization tools, security, privacy. So there's a whole list, and I would refer people to the Wiggins et al. Article that really gets at all of these aspects of data management. And tied to data management is this idea of data validation or data quality that is aligned to the project scale. So if you're working at a very small type of project, you might be able to actually quantify and qualify every piece of data through something like in-person assessment. But if you have thousands and thousands of participants, that's unlikely. You can't validate each data piece like that. So you'll rely on different things like statistical analyses or regional reviewers or even machine learning and consensus. So knowing where where you can successfully validate data, all the data, is really important. And then finally, how will you know what works? And if your project is moving toward its goals and even meeting its goals. So evaluation of your project can do many things, but importantly, it can improve its overall effectiveness. It can gather evidence of success, which we're always looking for. It will help you understand audience needs, which do change as they engage in your project over time. It will help you sustain or obtain additional funding, or it can. And over time, evaluation can help measure the collective impact of the field. And evaluation can take many forms. It is often tied to the stage of a project's life cycle, so such that at the start of the project, you'll be doing more needs assessment or front-end evaluation to inform design. During a project, it's more formative, and you might be looking to test products or usability. And then once a project is well established, not necessarily over, but well established, summative evaluations come into play to measure outcomes and see to the extent that you are meeting the goals and outcomes you set out for in the very beginning. At the Cornell Lab where I work, we've developed a user's guide for evaluating summative outcomes from citizen science related to learning. The user's guide pictured here on the right is just an overview of techniques and tips and best practices. It's free and available download from the Citizen Science Association website. Also, as part of this NSF funded effort, we developed a framework for measuring common learning outcomes that are pictured in that pie chart there that are very typical of citizen science projects. And the instruments that we created are easy to use in the informal settings that most citizen science projects tend to take place. And we're actually starting to build a nice library of knowledge and history of each of these scales and how they have worked in different citizen science settings. And also, just in the process of evaluation, care must be taken to commit to ethical practices involving volunteer participation, such as informed consent, risk, confidentiality, and any legal issues and liability. So in closing, I will just argue that attending to issues related to the outcomes, understanding your audience, communicating and engaging your audience for long-term retention, building infrastructure for dynamic communication, managing and respecting the data, and then evaluating along the way are key principles to project success, no matter the project type or the focus. And I'd also point out the free online book by the National Academies on Designing for Learning through Citizen Science that covers a lot of what I discussed here, but in obviously much more detail. And additionally, you can find numerous guides and best practices for everything from data management and evaluation to increasing equity, diversity, inclusion at the CSA website at citizenscience.org. And with that, I will say thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tina. So just to keep things, I know, we don't want to keep the moving so long, so let's go right to Darlene, our next panelist.
Great, that was great. Thank you, Tina. I'm going to share my slides here. And let's see if this works. All right, let's see if I can get this over here. Okay, is that sized well? Everybody see that? Yeah, okay, great. I'm Darlene Cavalier, very honored to be here. super excited to follow up on all that Tina just shared. My name, I already gave my name, sorry. I founded SciStarter, which is a website that helps connect people to citizen science projects. So SciStarter basically serves the participants or would-be participants. These are the volunteers or the citizen scientists, as well as the project scientists seeking to recruit those volunteers, and researchers who study the field of citizen science. More and more, we're starting to support the very important role of knowledge brokers that are the facilitators. So this is a little bit of a crowded slide that just talks about the different things that SciStarter serves. We have evaluation tools. A lot of this is informed by what Tina just shared there too. We actually have a database of physical tools, low-cost instruments. We do a lot of professional development with these facilitators or these knowledge brokers. And we spend a lot of time looking at all the barriers that exist. What's preventing people from discovering these amazing opportunities to engage in real and important science, from accessing the tools that might be required to engage in that? That could be Wi-Fi, or that could be somewhat of a complicated sensor, to understanding how to continue to keep that group or that individual, engaged over time, and to help them move along a continuum of opportunities to strengthen and deepen their engagement. So this is another very busy slide, but I figured I would just talk in practical terms here of how we work with different communities. Those communities are also looking at some of the considerations that Tina mentioned. I made some notes here. Everything from understanding if they want their community, so this could be the Girl Scouts as one example. Are they seeking engagement for the sake of engagement or to learn more about science? Are they looking to get involved in policy issues? Are they looking to monitor environmental issues that they're concerned about as a community? The facilitators or the communities are thinking through much of what Tina described. The project owners are thinking through, which I found real interesting there in that analogy. So with the Girl Scouts, we work closely with the Girl Scouts to understand those considerations, help them identify criteria that can be used to select projects to introduce to their community. The Girl Scouts kind of introduced an interesting use case for us too, because it started to become very clear that if the actual facilitator, so the Girl Scout troop leader, is not comfortable or confident in introducing citizen science to her community, this goes nowhere. And we know that is very true of educators and teachers and other people who have the direct access to their communities. So we pivoted a bit in the past year or two to really focus on how we can support these super important gatekeepers of knowledge and engagement opportunities. So with the Girl Scouts, of course, it's the troop leaders. With the libraries, which you can see on the screen there, it's the actual librarian herself. So how do we help her feel more comfortable and confident in understanding citizen science and introducing citizen science to the patrons in her community? And it's not too unlike the ASU Osher Lifelong Learning Group. So these are the 55 and older community that are already interested in getting involved in citizen science. As it turns out, a number of these members want to be the ones who are introducing citizen science to their peers and to others, ironically through public libraries where they are already spending a lot of time. And then we have media partners like Discover Magazine and National Geographic who already reach communities. So how do we work with them to make it easier for them to embed opportunities to engage in topics that the readers are already interested in? And then lastly, I have up here as an example, Verizon. And so Verizon uses SciStarter for their employee volunteer platform. So they reward their employees to actually spend time volunteering for science through SciStarter. So the other thing that these present are examples of how different communities may have different incentives and motivations, they definitely have different ways of communicating with their audiences, which we found super interesting as well. They know how to talk to their audiences better than we ever could, and probably better than most project owners would be able to. So in some ways, by identifying your communities and identifying the knowledge broker there or the facilitator and working with him or her to create, to basically collaborate on approaches, relieves the burden from this project scientist of having to actually understand each of these communities and talk in a talk that makes sense to them, that's comfortable, and that is known to work with these communities. We have some level of evidence, and I'm going to show you on the next slides, from summative evaluation that we've done with the librarians that shows that when you do support that facilitator, I mean, it's obvious, but it's nice to have evidence there. When you support that facilitator, you'll see better and sustained engagement in projects over time, and not just a project, multiple projects, which is also pretty cool. In the case of the libraries, lack of access to instruments, lack of access, easy access to related programs, and basically everything everybody needs, just kind of put together simply, resulted in a program where we have kits, citizen science kits, in circulation in libraries in Arizona. And we're very excited that that program has just been rewarded funding from the Institutes for Museum and Library Services to scale nationally over the next 3 years. So we'll have more and more information and evaluation to share back with you in terms of which approaches work best with different types of communities. The reason why we love that project so much is because those communities already serve populations that are pretty difficult to reach. They serve populations across every metric of underserved and underrepresented communities. And they also are a good social service to many communities. So they may be hosting the AA and the NA meetings there. And as it turns out, many members of these communities are looking for important ways to feel like they're a important part of society, and citizen science is a great tool for that. So on the bottom here, I've kind of bold-faced why we enjoy or why we think it's important to support these facilitators when they feel comfortable. They're key to translating the information that we need to translate to their communities. They typically already have built-in incentives. So for the Girl Scouts, it's pretty easy to see what that is. That's the badge. They actually get a badge by doing certain projects through citizen science and through SciStarter. And they don't just do the projects. When they finish a project, they actually need to do a take action project as well. So this is how they kind of pay it back to their community. They take what they learn and they share it with their community. And some of those girls have done pretty incredible things with their take action projects. This ongoing support leads to sustained engagement, which we know can increase opportunities for learning and definitely produce better data quality. This is just an example of what we did with work with the librarians to help introduce patrons to citizen science. Just made it very easy for them to understand what it is, who can do it, how to join, and why participate. We work with the instructional designers at Arizona State University who have an eye towards making sure that these are inclusive approaches here. So as Tina mentioned, appropriate use of images, even audio, the type of voices that we're using for these videos, projects that we select, and so forth. Let's see. This is just an example of one of the kits currently in circulation in the library. It's pretty neat because the librarians get to customize these and put in related programming notes, reading list, information about community meetups that relate to the project. And also the community decides which project they're interested in. They have community dialogues. That's starnet.org. I would take a look at that. Lots of resources for librarians. We followed the model that they produced to help generate these mini community dialogues to help understand what issues patrons are curious or concerned about. So we start there. And I know I'm running out of time, but here's an ugly slide that will point you to some of the summative evaluations. So I mentioned the IMLS project that is scaling throughout the country over the next 3 years. we'll have more and more information to share on that in terms of the evaluation and the data outcomes. Parallel to that, another project that's running for the next 3 years will hopefully take what we've learned from citizen science and how to engage more and more people. There's thousands of projects registered on SciStarter. There's close to 90,000 registered users of SciStarter and millions more who come to the site. And all the data that we've generated that has helped advance the field, we're now looking at ways to connect citizen science with other forms of public engagement in science through a project that's funded by the National Science Foundation and led by Martin Scorstate and SciStarter team and other researchers. And I'm happy to answer questions about that too. And I'll stop now. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Amazing. And now let's turn it over to Rebecca.
Hi, I'm just about to share my screen here, making sure I can get it open. And then we shall
Can you turn your volume up a little bit too?
Oh, sure. Is it, oh, here. That's why I put this
There
on
we
so
go.
that I could be heard.
Yes.
Here we go. All right, sharing screen. Thank you, everyone, for I can't do two things at once, for being here today. It is an honor to be with this panel. There we go. It's like, give me a second here, and now we should have it, right? Okay, thanks. My name is Rebecca Jordan. I am at Michigan State University. I am in the Department of Community Sustainability. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of the projects that emerged from my collaborativescience.org project. This was a pretty large NSF funded project, which we were able to support a number of different citizen science programs out of this project. And so years later after funding, I'm still sort of working with groups within this project. And basically the idea was to create an online portal to allow groups in particular areas create adaptive management sort of schemes that might link people in the cyberspace to allow people who are in very local spots to regionally connect with other spots. And again, with the interest of adaptive management and particular resources, usually land-based resources. And so this was a way to enable public audiences and individuals who were highly interested in their local resources become involved with the formal management process, essentially. And so they were engaged in an adaptive management plan that looked a lot like the one on the slide. And in addition, though, we used modeling as the sort of central theme around these projects. And so this would fall under the broader umbrella of sort of participatory modeling. And I worked with a group of folks who met at the Social Ecological Synthesis Center, Social Environmental Synthesis Center in Annapolis, Maryland, to sort of define or maybe to set some boundaries as we understand it around participatory modeling. And so we sort of came up with this definition, which is still very broad, but it allows decision-making that will engage stakeholders, often members of the public, into this modeling process that allows for sort of a shared representation of reality. So it sort of looking at it from the management perspective sort of takes it out of the hands entirely of the formal managers and includes more broadly other stakeholders in this process. And so there's all kinds of steps in this process. And from the early sort of identifying problems all the way out until we see action being taken around these problems. If you're thinking about sort of contributory, or what I kind of think of as maybe more traditional type citizen science models, where people who I'm talking with come into this discussion about citizen science, the idea that a scientist may have a particular problem wanting to engage the public in engagement. You can see that that's a portion of this participatory modeling process. When we think more broadly about citizen science and its definition in terms of knowledge co-creation, a little more of what I think both Tina and Darlene's projects and ideas really alluded to, we see that there's many points where there's like an overlap between what we're trying to do with participatory modeling in certain communities and citizen science. And so the idea really is, for our project, was to use this model as what I call a boundary object. And I think it really taps into what Darlene was talking about with this idea that we have these sort of knowledge brokers. And so I consider them, using sort of an anthropological metaphor, as these traders, right? If we think back to when individuals of two different cultures or communities came together to trade, they found an emergence of individuals who sort of spoke both languages as a way to facilitate this trading process. And in some ways, I was sort of thinking about the library or the librarian in Darlene's talk as maybe working to kind of translate or things into culturally appropriate languages, being these types of knowledge traders. And so, well, what are they trading? What are they working on? What is the object or the thing in question that they're actually dealing with? We often find that the project, right, that's what we're sort of thinking about as this sort of central object, but how do we facilitate that conversation was a challenge that we thought modeling, in this case, using a specific modeling software, helped us to sort of overcome. And so the idea is that they would work with Mental Modeler to sort of take different individual ideas. So individuals would then put down their conceptions of what's happening through a very guided process of putting ideas onto models that then would enable them to sort of integrate these models into a common space. And so Mental Modeler is a tool that we use to do so. It's based on fuzzy cognitive mapping, which is based on fuzzy logic, which the idea is, as you put parts into this, you can sort of identify pluses and minuses as to how much things influence each other. And then the fuzzy math around that, which is called, because you have this from 1 to -1 level of influence. It's a very relative idea, so that if you're talking about, and in this model is just really dealing with an engine and, you know, thrust in terms of movement forward, how much do the rotations per minute influence that thrust? Is it a lot? Is it a little? That's the kind of language that occurs around these types of conversations. And so what I'll talk about today, just very briefly, is an example of a community that used this approach. And so in Highland Park, New Jersey, and so I used to be at Rutgers University, and Highland Park is very close to the university, I was contacted by a group of people who learned about collaborativescience.org and wanted to know if they could use some of the resources available in collaborative science to address the question of water quality in their communities. They had, that was about the time that many of the stories around Flint, Michigan had emerged, and they were concerned about their own water quality and didn't really know where to begin. And so they had contacted some scientists who sort of said, well, we don't really have time, maybe contact this person, who said, well, we don't really have time, contact that person. And so they found our project and enrolled. And so basically the process started such that individuals were brought together into a sort of convening event where they began to place ideas that they had about the system into this modeling context and begin to identify what they thought was sort of affecting what is driving what, and how does that impact the state that they wanted to see, which in this case was water quality. And so here are two individuals interested in the project, coming to it from very different backgrounds and their sort of naive ideas about what was happening. And as you can see, a lot of their ideas are really rather sophisticated without the aid of science at all, or scientists rather at all. And then we, as a group, collaboratively identified the gaps of what it was that they knew and what it was that they wanted to know. So sort of on the upper side of the screen, you can see all the terms that they all used. And then on the right, we begin to appropriate those terms by deciding which two things might mean the same, and so we don't need to use both, which things are different. And this allows for everybody in the room to ensure that their ideas are on that model versus privileging certain types of knowledge over others. And then from there, we were able to sort of identify in the center of the model what it was that individuals wanted to know. So it was a way of forming the question that allowed for very pointed, targeted data gathering instead of sort of, well, we don't know, let's collect data on everything, let's decide what we're doing. They realized that, wow, there was information and other sources that they could get, that they could know if they looked or asked the right people. And what was it that was truly unknown that warranted additional data collection? And so then they were able to start a project with citsci.org, get into that, gather data, begin to create through the citsci.org's tools, graphs, things like that. And then it allowed them to go to a scientist and say, look, this is my question, this is what I have. And therefore the scientist was able to say, you know, take 20 minutes to discuss this, address this in a way that they weren't willing to engage when everything was sort of broad and fuzzy. And so from there, that really the turbidification ended up being a major problem for water quality and what they wanted to do. They were able to gather data around that. They were able to submit data to the State Department of Environmental Quality and work with them to get some information out of that. And then they were able to move on to a planning process to say, what do we need to do about it? Which points in that system can we affect that will give us the outcome more that we want? And that's where really the software can help. And so, so sort of the end result with that project is that individuals had a very targeted plan of action of what they needed to do that I would argue happened rather efficiently and perhaps wouldn't have without a sort of process built around that. So we were able to look at the groups who modeled versus other groups that we knew of that weren't using this process. And they took, it was more efficient, right? They had more time on task, less time to decide on projects. And individuals, we also were able to collect some data for individuals who were in citizen science modeling projects through collaborativescience.org, and those who chose not to engage the modeling in collaborativescience.org. And we found that those who were engaged in the modeling process also brought some tools when it came to research design and questions away from that project that they could use in other spaces that we didn't see in those who hadn't done that. And what I thought was what we got from a lot of data collected from the local area managers and city councils was that the model was helpful in sort of pointing a point of communication. It took what they had considered laypersons and people that maybe they weren't inviting to the conversation to then say, hey, look at these models, they're pretty sophisticated. These people might know what they're talking about, let's listen to them. And so that was a very important result, I think, which came to us also from the members of the community who were part of this project. And so now we're taking some of these approaches, interestingly, to Flint, Michigan, which was sort of the initiator to the project that, that I just talked about through a Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research grant, which I know I saw Miles McNeil posted a question, who's part of that project, and a huge number of members in our department are part of the project. And so the mental modeling practices that we had developed through other contexts are now being used in very real, very important situations like the Flint situation. And so that is the Raritan River Bridge. I acknowledge National Science Foundation again for funding the collaborativescience.org interface, and look forward to questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That sounds like a really interesting project. And now we get to hear from our final panelist, Maja Horst.
Yes, so just bear with me. So I want to start by thanking you for inviting me to this panel. We're going to change gear a little bit, but I want to start also by saying thank you for making me write that statement, because it actually made me articulate things that I think I have been increasingly knowing in my heart, but not really saying out loud to myself. So that was a very good exercise to do. So I have been studying controversies over emerging science and technology for 20, 30 years. And basically, right from the beginning, I was struck by how these controversies are not just about the technology in question, but they're about the basic view on science and technology, and whether science is making our future society better or worse, despite the fact that I think all of us would agree that it's sort of at least an important part of solutions. I mean, to some people, it is not. And I mean, the whole field of science and technology studies within which I find myself kind of took controversies as a call to say there's a need for more dialogue and engagement with science. And I guess originally it was a lot about giving public a voice. And that's where my reflections came in, because when I was writing that, I realized that actually nowadays, I think maybe the core question is shifting some way away from being a question about giving a public a voice and how we mediate between science and democracy, to actually simply, can we keep having a discussion? Can we keep having a public dialogue about things that are important to us? And I know, watching from Europe, watching the US, I think your experiences of this failing dialogue is more stark than what we experience here. And I live in a very small, quite homogeneous political culture where there's still quite a lot of social cohesion, but I can also see how important it is to keep that going. So in the spirit of this, and also because of my research subject, you know, I was often talking about the need for public dialogue. And then I was doing it in the same way as now, you know, very one-way engagement. I kind of very early on got interested in seeing if I could talk about my science in a different way by inviting people into a dialogue where maybe I wouldn't talk so much and other people might do what they wanted to do. So I have been experimenting with, let me see if I can change this slide. Yep. So I've been experimenting with making public engagement installations, trying to create spaces that invite people into dialogue and letting them experience dilemmas and discussions rather than just being told about them. And I'm going to show you in a little bit, or Megan is going to help me show you a little video that kind of explains what this installation is, how it works. But I just want to say it's something we made for the Science in the City Festival, which is a big science festival that accompanies the big Euroscience Open Forum, which is basically the European imitation of the AAAS conference in the States. So it's a big, big conference with about 5,000 science policy actors coming. And then there's this big science festival, and it was held in Copenhagen in 2014. And for that, we made this installation. And it was based on a research paper that I'd published in Journal of Responsible Innovation together with a PhD student of mine, where in which we had a project on the social responsibility of science. And one of the things we did was to look in academic journals to see how scientists and other scholars would talk normatively about what the social responsibility of science is. And to you, it can't be a big surprise that while everybody agrees, of course, that that's a good idea and we need more social responsibility, there was very stark disagreement about what that would actually mean. So we did a Foucauldian discourse analysis and came up with these four ideals or rationalities of science. And just to say very briefly, so on the one end, we have demarcation, where the whole point, where the responsibility of scientists is to not be influenced unduly by diverse social interests. Whereas on the other hand, we have this integration ideal where the whole point is that if science is to be responsible, it has to integrate social actors in order to make sure that science is done from ideals that are shared with or aligned with society. So those two at least are quite incommensurable. And I won't really talk more about that because the point is not that analysis, but more to say that we use that as we we used that as the basis for the installation. And then basically we created something physical where people could go in and experience these 4 discourses and the way they don't relate, rather than us talking about them. And this is where I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then ask Megan to help me show you the video. And I hope this is going to work. Yeah, look at that.
Welcome to a digital tour of the installation, Breaking and Entering. Explore how science and society relate. There's no right or wrong way to meet the installation. The most important thing is curiosity and a desire to have your opinions challenged. The white tower in the middle of the installation presents 4 different perspectives on the ideal relationship between science and society. These ideals contain very diverse understandings of the social responsibility of science. Each entrance represents one ideal, and hence a certain understanding of the role of science in society. At the counter, you can pick up an iPad and use it to find a number of images throughout the installation and scan them. When you scan an image, a video starts and elaborates on the subject that the image represents. In entrance 1, you can build on to the scientific structure and maybe contribute to the development of true knowledge. Here, science is separated from society, and the scientists decide themselves which areas need attention. In entrance 2, you, as a scientist, have to look out into society and be aware of its problems and challenges. Science has to focus on research that works to solve these problems. In entrance 3, you as a citizen can say which societal problems you believe should be solved. Then it's the job of politicians and society to choose the most important problems that science should work to solve. In entrance 4, a close collaboration and open dialogue between scientists and citizens ensures that the most important problems of society are solved. Around the White Tower are several stations where you can let your opinion be heard. Among other things, you can write down your hopes and fears for the future, consider the degree of risk that science can cause, or cast a vote on who should prioritize funds for scientific research. All the examples used in the installation are based in the new field synthetic biology and the solutions and problems that this field poses. There are no easy answers or quick solutions, but by exploring the relationship between science and society, you're already off to a good start. If you want more information, please go to www.breaking/entering.dk.
Yes, so thank you very much. I hope you got the gist. I think the pictures were a bit grainy and what's the word in English? Whatever. I hope you kind of saw what, the idea of it. And I just want to end by having a few reflections on this, and I'm happy to answer questions you might have. I will also make sure you get the link to the video so you can see more if you're interested. But let me just say that while this was sort of an effort of science communication, it was very it was very clear also while we were doing it that there was a certain logic of success, which is numbers who visit your installation. That's important. Everybody asks you about that. And of course, I don't believe in that, but yet I was still very happy to see that people actually did come, they did go in, they did engage, they did stay there, they did lots of things. So in that sense, there's a first success, which is sort of that it works, that it actually does something. I think that our point is more, and that is where it's very difficult to kind of measure success, because our point is that we want people to experience things and to be prompted to reflect rather than to kind of get to know certain facts about science. So, and that also means it's extremely difficult to see whether that happens, because you're just looking at people and they engage, but they might be doing very different things in their brains while they do that. So it's a very, on the one hand, it is a very controlled setup in the sense that we kind of do stuff and we've thought a lot about how we want people to engage. On the other hand, when you're actually there, it's very uncontrolled in the sense that visitors come in and they do all sorts of things with the installation, and they write all sorts of comments, and some of them are about science in society, and some of them are about a completely different set of issues that take up space for that. And I guess in the sense of this conference, I just want to say that for me, success is also at the point in time where we are now. Success also has to be about simply establishing that space for meeting, for reflection, for actually making sure that people can say and interact with whatever voice they have or want to have. And I think we need more spaces for that kind of inclusive engagement. And I think my experience also having worked with a lot of, I would say, normal scientists who don't go out and do citizen science, who don't go out and engage with a lot of people. My experience is that actually it takes quite a lot of courage for them to dare go into that room of kind of chaotic, unknown engagements, reactions. And I think there was a time when my field of research was sort of very critical of the scientists and their deficit models. But actually right now, the more I do this with scientists, the more I think that it's also very important to kind of be more loyal, or, you know, friendly, or just stay with there. We don't have to agree with each other, but at least we kind of, you know, take each other's hands and go into this space of unknown, chaotic, different kinds of things that happen together. I think that is actually, these days, I think that has to count as success as well. And that's what you made me reflect upon with that task. And I'm very grateful for you to do that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for writing them. They're really great to read and to share with everyone. So thank you so much for all of your talks. And now I want to give you guys time to talk to each other, because you have amongst you a wealth of experience and insight on these issues of public engagement. And does anyone want to ask anyone else any questions amongst the panel? Go right ahead, Maja.
So I would like to ask this, because I really liked all your three talks, and I thought they went really well together. I would like to ask you if there was a time in space where you thought, oh, I've really learned something that kind of influences back on my own research or research practice, or, you know, have you taken something back into, you know, what happens in your laboratory or your office, wherever that is?
That's a super interesting question, Maja. So from my perspective, I would say that one of the things that I've really come to learn over the last decade, in 2009, a group of us wrote a report that was public participation in scientific research, defining the field, and we laid out these models of engagement around the science process that was sort of co-created, contributory, collaborative models, and we put it out there as something that needed further testing, right? That this is what we saw at that point in time. Rebecca was part of that, and I think that what has occurred, and I've reflected a lot upon in the last 10 years since that report was out, is that those models are really wishy-washy. And the idea that, for example, contributory projects focus simply on data collection is not accurate, right? Even through my own dissertation and interviewing 70 plus people and survey responses from 1,500 or more people spanning all different types of projects, even contributory projects, the participants decide how much they want to engage. So if there's an opportunity for them to explore and analyze data or read journals, articles, they will do it if that is what they want to do. So it's not so much about like, this is what a co-created or this is what a contributory project looks like. It's more about what are the opportunities that projects allow for, right? And I would argue that no matter what the project is, they should allow for engagement in all aspects of the science process, whether that starts with, generating questions or hypotheses all the way down the line to actually being part of authorship or finding solutions to on-the-ground practical problems. The sort of flip side of that is that we envision that co-created projects were something that if you're doing a co-created project, an individual engages in all aspects. Well, that is not true either, right? So a co-created project is supposed to afford all those opportunities, but people feel very comfortable in certain aspects of that engagement, but not in all aspects, right? So it's very rare to find someone who is engaged in every single part of that process. And so there's just been a lot of evolution in my thinking about those models and the utility of those models in the last 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca, do you want to comment on your experience over there?
Sure. As Maya asked the question, I sort of jotted it down, and then I was thinking about the 20 different ways you could answer it, and then Tina answered the question, and it was like immediately sort of relating to Tina's experience as well, is that I sort of saw this as sort of a conjecture of maybe a way to put light boundaries around something, maybe a way to think about things to sort of push the field forward, to challenge, to that kind of process that I think is so healthy in knowledge generation. And then, like Tina, I was surprised to find that people were like, okay, it's done, and here it is. And so I was like, wow, we still are citing that, but yet there's been a lot of great work by Tina and other people that, dig that, to bring that out, because now we're evolving. And so, so that really resonated with me, even in sort of today's discussions. Tina brought up some things like this idea of relevance that really got me thinking about science, relevant to the community relevant to science. And one thing that really struck me was that scientists in some ways don't necessarily always have to sell their relevance, right? They can sort of, sometimes it's okay to say science for science sake. And so it is interesting for me to look at this sort of very applied environment and realize, wow, that they've got an additional pressure put on them that in a way, as you were saying, it's such a challenge for scientists to get out there that, we really are talking about such different communities, and then Tina's statements about this sort of DEI, and that is something that I think things like the Citizen Science Association and other organizations really value and really can push forward. But where is the real mandate in science or things like that to do that? So it got me thinking, wow, a lot of what science and the calls around science really are not as value embedded as, and there's this tension between sort of values and this, so to speak, objectivity, even though we know it kind of doesn't really exist, sort of thing, that there's always an element of subjectivity. So the talks today, and then I mentioned before this kind of knowledge broker that Darlene was bringing up, and then thinking about your space as being that knowledge broker and a different way to show learners. So even a conference today where I've known Darlene and Tina for years and heard about the great work that they've been doing and involving, still gets me thinking and changing. And but to answer the question in a more overall space, perhaps for me, it has made me probably a better researcher, sort of engaging people through this process of research, engaging them in sort of saying, okay, here's this model of how you think the world works. Where do we need to gather the data or the evidence to sort of support some of these pieces? Where are these pieces being refuted, and what does that mean? And that's caused me, I think, in my own data collection to do so in a better manner, because we're always pushing at that boundary in terms of the work that I do. So very broadly, I think that's really changed with time. So thank you.
How about you, Darlene? How has the sort of changing landscape of citizen science affected your practice, founding all these things?
I've become acutely aware of how difficult it is to get involved in citizen science as a participant. And that's after years of telling everybody how easy and fun it is. We actually got into the weeds of trying to do it. And I would say our team at SciStarter and ASU, our eyes have been opened up partly because of COVID. We're now facilitating a lot more than we had before online, but it can be very difficult for somebody 55 and older population, one, just getting on Zoom to understand how to do the project. And my goodness, when an app is involved, that's a whole new set of circumstances. So just getting them to the start line is difficult. And that's not just 55 and older, that's just almost
Everybody. We all have.
So the technical part, building awareness and getting them actually engaged in the right project that matters to them is one. And then also how much scaffolding is needed, almost like bookends. You may have an amazing project that hits on a lot of what Tina and our other speakers described, but you might not have, the skills or the resources to be able to do some of that onboarding and then the support at the other end. And the other end has become very interesting. This is because we're in the weeds again, we can actually hear some of these stories of what happens that can't be described or shared within the framework of a specific project. And these are usually stories that people are sharing with us. This comes in the form of those take action projects that I mentioned with the Girl Scouts. How would that project scientist ever know what those girls went on to do? So they were sparked by the project. They contributed data to the project. They learned, they did what they needed to do. But that project may not have built in those opportunities to continue to do more, to take action on what you know. And for communities, this is where the rubber hits the road. You may have just learned how to do a protocol that can be very valuable because it's an issue that you're curious or concerned about. But it's what happens after that, whether they're affecting policy, whether they're just making changes on their street or in their neighborhood or at home. We're now starting to build more and more of those portfolios. And Leah had a question of where things go in the next 3 to 5 years, possibly with citizen science. I think there's a real opportunity to find ways to share those stories. They end up, in the end, may be more meaningful than the actual scientific research in terms of the participant, to understand that, my mother-in-law got involved in one of the projects and now she has a complete, she has a whole pollinator garden in her backyard and she's a dedicated citizen scientist all the time. She's somebody who's been locked in her house because of COVID. She's gotten engaged in these online projects. So that's just one example. We have a community out in Arizona that is up against an active mine and they felt that they were getting sick. Now they didn't know how to generate credible evidence to be taken seriously. So we help them with the existing projects, basically just putting together a bunch of existing projects and showing them how to use some of the low-cost air quality sensors. So in the end, just long story short with that one, they generated enough evidence that they called upon the EPA to come in. That mine is now closed down. It's not just because of this community, but they were able to be taken seriously and not just say, I'm sick, I'm coughing a lot. They understood what particulate matter meant and when to be a little bit alarmed about it. But those stories, there's no air quality sensor story where they can share that back and say, this is what happened in our community. We came together. So I would love to have our team and the whole field of practice start thinking of ways that those stories can be shared because they are powerful.
Exactly. That's a really great point. We are starting to get questions from our overall group and I want to have time for them. So I want to turn this over now to some of that. And the first question I will ask, because it was actually very similar to one I was going to ask anyway, from Nitya Bhaskaran. She says, thank you for your interesting presentations. I wanted to ask about how you work with scientists and train them to engage with the community and evaluate them. And in particular, how do you help the scientists move into those spaces that Maja was describing as chaotic? How do we support scientists to do this? I don't know who wants to take that first.
Well, I can say a little bit. which is that I think there's a lot in the collegiality, loyalty, the sort of saying, okay, you know, I will go there with you, but I'm actually interested in. So I do, for instance, now I've moved to the technical university. I teach students, and often I get one of my professor colleagues from one of the other departments, sort of the engineering professors, to come, and then I talk about their research and ask them all the difficult questions. And because it's engineering students, it's not so dangerous because they can they're still at home. But then I can ask them those questions that they might be asked by a journalist. And I think they kind of like to have those, so to say, practice runs. And then, of course, because I asked them about controversial aspects, whereas I think a lot of the citizen science projects would be different because there it's more obvious that science could be helpful or the technologies could be helpful to problems that people have. So it's a different way. But I think this, I mean, engaging with all sorts of different communities is difficult in the sense that if you've never even tried, you have to be able to practice how you talk about what it is that you're doing. And I think that's another way of creating those spaces for simply doing the practice.
How about the rest of you? Do you have any insights on how to help scientists get supported through these processes?
Well, there's great resources from AAAS and so forth that I would definitely check out. But also sometimes maybe that scientist doesn't have to be the one doing the engagement. I mean, we rarely do things with the actual scientists in some of the work that we do. Occasionally they'll be called upon to join a Zoom call to talk about their research with the Girl Scouts or one of these communities. But I think that's a real point for people who are considering setting up a citizen science project and might not be interested in going all in because they don't feel comfortable communicating directly with the public, that they don't always have to. There are intermediary vessels that can help with that.
Yeah, I would just underscore developing interdisciplinary teams. And so you have the scientist working on the science. You should have someone who has a social science expertise or comes from the humanities, or if you're dealing, if you're making a concerted effort to work with underserved communities, having someone who has that connection, that expertise, whether it's a knowledge broker or a facilitator. Scientists need lots of training in this regard, but I have found there's very few that even with adequate training feel 100% comfortable in these spaces. And like Darlene said, AAAS has a lot of great resources, but I think creating an interdisciplinary team is probably the most successful way to make those connections happen.
Can I just add a little bit?
Yeah.
Because I totally understand, and I also agree that we shouldn't make all scientists go and talk to the public. At the same time, I think it's really dangerous to sort of say that we can do outreach and dissemination, communication, engagement as a sort of add-on to the science, and that we should leave that to the experts in this, because I think the core democratic discussion about science and its role in society, like we also discussed in the first session of this conference, for that to work, I think we do need to have this sort of direct interaction. And I know, I mean, it's precisely because it's uncomfortable and scary and they need practice, the scientists, is why I think we also need to help them do this.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I definitely agree. And in an ideal world, that's the goal. We just know that there are some, I agree.
Okay, we have another question from Ben Pauley for Rebecca. So firstly, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask about the potential for the mental modeler approach to have an empowering effect on local groups that are working to create change within their communities. It was intriguing to hear about some of the ways in which mental modeling helped facilitate deliberation and decision-making in Highland Park, Incidentally, I'm also Rutgers grad and I know Highland Park well. I'm wondering though, to what extent testimony from the residents themselves is being incorporated into your assessment of the success of the tool? How are you engaging their own sense of their empowerment and whether it has had a lasting effect? And then to make the connection to Flint, where I live and work, I'm wondering if you and your colleagues have gathered any kind of testimony that that nature might offer insights into the relative success of mental modeling here.
Hi, Ben. That is a big question. I think, so yeah, we, as part of the assessment of the project, everybody who was involved was interviewed, and then we interviewed individuals who sort of had reason to interface with the model. That could be individuals on that Highland Park has a strong environmental planning committee within the township. And so we were able to talk to folks from there too, not everybody, but some. And so the modeling, I think in the beginning was sort of, you know, they did it. Some people were like, this is weird, I don't want to. Other people sort of were like, fine, I did it. I didn't really think that much about it. And so pushing them to say, no, really try to think about it and engage with it a little bit. It wasn't extremely challenging, but it was helpful that I could bring them into the same space. We've done some projects where people have been entirely remote, and it's a little bit harder. But once people were able to sort of see, number one, how we could build scenarios, and number two, how it can be used. And I think number three, the sort of respect that weirdly they're like, this picture did it. But for for the scientific community, or maybe for communities who are used to more data and whatnot, yeah, that picture sort of did it in the way that I think Darlene explained with her example. Having data sort of privileges you in certain conversations. Whether or not I agree with that is totally on the side. But so that helped, and people really appreciated that. And so a number of people, one individual in the project was sort of a union organizer and wanted to take this to work with some of the union work she was doing. Another person was a school teacher, so they took that. So they also took the model and used it for different reasons. And so I think it did, and in all the communities, I think it probably did a little bit better in projects where the actions were more immediate. We've got groups in Virginia who were able to earn, one group earned $200,000 from the Soil Conservation District. So they were like, yeah, this is awesome. Other groups sort of, we're like, well, we found this out, they're not going to change the management of these lands. We're disappointed. And so they're going back to look for like the real true tool that will do it. And I'm trying to tell them, well, this is a science for decision making. Science in a management context is as much about the people involved as it is the data. And so, and there's a lot of political interest and things like that. So, they're learning. I think in Flint, there's a great potential, and I don't know if you're maybe familiar with Laura Schmidt-Albisi and Stephen Gray. They're the team. Stephen's the one who worked with me, and we created this mental modeler interface. They're the ones that are spearheading that in the Flint group. I think that there is a lot of potential there. We're working with the Community Foundation of Greater Flint. COVID, right, in not allowing us to sit down with people is making it a little more challenging. But I do think that there is a lot of potential for this tool, this discussive piece to do a lot for us. And in addition to Mental Modeler, we're also using system dynamic modeling and a couple other participatory approaches. But I'd love to talk more with you offline so I don't take up the whole time here about some of its uses or things that you'd like to maybe see or think about. So definitely.
Okay, great. We have a question from Deborah Cohen, who says, it's great to hear about these projects and how much careful thought is going into designing them. My question is how we might help scientists get credit for taking part in such initiatives. Do you have any ideas for reforming the tenure system to reward such work? That's a great question.
Well,
Oh dear. Do we need another conference for that? No.
I'll just say that in some universities, especially those that are land-grant universities, such as Cornell, where there's a thriving extension office, much of this work is really valued and encouraged. Community partnerships, community engagement partnerships, there's small funds that are happening that are being divvied up for these kinds of interactions and opportunities to more directly engage scientists with communities. That said, I think the currency of academia is still publications, and I don't have an answer to how we rework the tenure system. But I think the needle is moving a little bit. I don't know, Rebecca's more in the thick of that environment, so she probably has more to add to that.
I certainly have a lot to add. I don't know if any of it's good. I don't know if anyone agrees, but being maybe a chairperson within the strongly land grant portion of MSU within that College of Ag and Natural Resources, we have a strong and vested interest to see community engagement and public interaction maybe more strongly than other parts of Michigan State University. But I think the reality is whether or not we want to, we're going to go into it either kicking and screaming, or we're going to go into it with our eyes open, in that so much of the work that scientists do at an institution like ours is publicly funded. And so as we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years, the constraints around that are increasing, and people are developing a greater consumer model as to what happens with tax dollars and things like that, that I think we're going to see 10 years from now, and maybe 10 years beyond that, a pretty big change in that type of reward system as universities seek to keep themselves afloat. The model of the 1960s into 70s about tenure is really changed quite a bit. We've seen academic freedom, sort of boundaries being set on that in a way in the last 10 years that we really haven't seen prior to that. And so yeah, there's going to be a change, I think. The question is, how painful is it going to be kind of going down? And I think that depends on institution leadership and the ability for people to kind of, act with some level of foresight versus react. And so it'll be interesting.
So I just wanted to add because having been for 8 years serving in a full-time management role, I think it was my experience that actually in the sort of leadership positions at the university, there was actually much more respect and need and wishes for public engagement than sort of on the more floor level of normal academics. And I think sometimes academics use it, and this is hard to say, but sometimes it's kind of used as an excuse that they don't get credit for doing this, and that's why they don't do it. Whereas actually they probably would get credit. I mean, I know I've had a lot of credit for the things that I've been doing, which hasn't given any official publications, certainly not at least compared to how much work I put into it. So I just want to say that I think there are actually more sides to this aspect. But of course, I mean, there is an issue about publications being the standard currency of academic work that we could discuss. So I don't disagree with the way the question's coming from. I just think that there might be more to add to this.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. The next one is from Renee Wallace, who's asking you to share some aspects of engaging with the public that are uncomfortable for scientists. What roles are incorporated in citizen science projects or methods that help address scientists' discomforts?
I sort of thought a lot about that. And I also want to just say hi to Renee. So double benefit here. I think the biggest challenge I've had in a very recent conversation is the idea of, and this is coming up in Flint, and it's coming up in food systems all around the state of Michigan, Renee, as well as some conversations I've had with folks in Detroit, is when experts are brought in, what is their role? At what level do they seek to sort of honor the wishes of the community And at what level do they say, as an expert, I think the path you're taking is the wrong one? And it's really challenging to watch something like that unfold, as I'm sure we all in Michigan did watch with what ultimately happened with the team that sort of initially brought some legitimacy, let's say, to the claims of what was happening with the water crisis in Flint, and then subsequently what happened with the scientists in Virginia and spaces beyond that, where the city ultimately ended up bringing up a lawsuit because the extent to which that sort of the scientists brought some of these issues. So that notion of ownership, that notion of expertise, these are particularly challenging. And I've had a hard time with scientists in some ways to come in and consult for them to say, but I think they're doing the wrong thing. You know, I think I'm an expert. What's the point of me studying this for all these years? And then to watch people then say, take my testimony and make a decision. And the decision isn't consistent with the data and all this stuff I've known for years and years and years. And so that is a real fear on the part of people who say, well, I don't want to get involved because, you know, it's like testimonies to Congress. They're going to do what they want with it. And it's sort of painful to watch that process. And so I think for me, when I engage scientists proper, whatever that means, when I engage experts, I often have to have some of these tough conversations to say, this is the process by which a decision is made, and your ideas are not going to be privileged because you're an expert. How uncomfortable are you with that? And so that's probably my biggest challenge when talking with people.
Final thoughts? Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just agree with Rebecca and just say, I think one of the related to that is many scientists haven't given enough credence to traditional ecological knowledge, right? So the knowledge that is born in a community by an individual, understanding the land, understanding the community, understanding the environment around them. And it's this, I'm the expert because I've been studying this for 20, 30 years without necessarily, you know, valuing to the same extent the knowledge that the community comes in with.
Yeah. So I hope we will keep discussing these things. Thank you very much for this panel to, you know, start these discussions in such a vibrant way after Debbie Cohen's keynote this morning.